Hi, everyone. My name is Moshe Naveh from the SAP community team. Welcome to our SAP community call about OpenAPI and the SAP Cloud SDK for JavaScript. I'll hand it over to Kavita to kick it off. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Warm welcome to today's community call. Today, you will be learning on how to easily consume OpenAPI services using the OpenAPI client generator of the SAP Cloud SDK for JavaScript. Before we get started, I just want to quickly introduce myself and my colleague. I'm Kavita, currently working as a developer with the SAP Cloud SDK team for Java. And joining me today is Marika, who will be presenting the crux of today's topic. And she's a senior developer with the SAP Cloud SDK for JavaScript team. Next slide, Marika. Before this, let me quickly point out that today, with a disclaimer, that we're not providing any official statements today. Please make your investing and project decisions based on what is available today. Next slide, Marika. Before I move on and talk about the latest updates from the SAP Cloud SDK, I would like to give a very short intro about the SDK for people who are maybe joining for the first time. So the SAP Cloud SDK is a set of libraries for developers to easily build applications in cloud-native way and host them on SAP Business Technology Platform or other runtimes. It is currently available in Java, JavaScript, and Typescript, and is well integrated with other SAP products like GAP, SAP S/4HANA, both on-premise and cloud, SAP SuccessFactors, and many more. With that short intro, let me move on to the latest updates for both the Java and JavaScript library of the SAP Cloud SDK. In the Java library, we released the OpenAPI client generator. This is also available in JavaScript. We released the type-safe pre-generated client library for BTP business rule service. We have also added support for OData v4 bound functions and actions. And we have also updated the API for batch requests, the change set API basically, and added support for function calls in batch requests of OData v2. Moving on to the JavaScript library updates, we have the OpenAPI client generator, which is generally available. And Marika would be talking about how to use this in the demo today. We have also released a pre-generated client library for SAP Workflow API service. Now I have linked all the documentation for all of these updates. So if you just click on the links linked here in the slides, you would get to read more about these updates. And I have also linked the release notes for both of the Cloud SDK versions here. With that, we can move on to the crux of today's presentation. Marika, I think you can take it over from here for the demo.
Okay, thanks, Kavita. So the demo that I will show you today, just to quickly give you an overview of what we're going to see, is going to contain four steps. First of all, I will show you how to generate or install a client. So either generate your own client or install a pre-generated client. Then I will show you some, and this is all for OpenAPI, as Kavita mentioned before. Then I will show you how to use the OpenAPI client. If you are familiar with the OData clients, this is quite similar. It's not exactly the same, but we reuse many of those concepts. Then the next step will be that I will show you how to customize the API that you're generating with the generator. So what is possible. This is mostly relevant for people who are owning the API, so not necessarily the consumers. Of course, consumers can also benefit from that, but I will show that in detail later on. And in the end, I wanted to show you a few tips and tricks that I think are useful if you're using the generator and using it on a daily basis. It might be helpful, to use those tricks. Okay, so first of all, let's start with the generation. I already, so I wrote down the steps, and for the demo, I already did that beforehand. But I will maybe run the last step to basically prove and show you how it works. To generate a client, you first of all need a specification, so that you would usually download from the API Hub, from the SAP API Hub, and or any other API Hub. So if you have your own specification, available somewhere, you have to have it locally as a file. Once that is downloaded, you have to install the OpenAPI generator. It is available through the NPM registry, so you can use whatever package manager you're using. For today's demo, I'm using NPM, but this also perfectly works with Yarn. So before I actually was doing this with Yarn, but I didn't want to confuse with two different package managers, so I now moved over to NPM. So the command is, as usual, npm install and then the name of the library. And here the OpenAPI generator library name is at SAP Cloud SDK / OpenAPI generator, with the typical at SAP Cloud SDK scope that we're using for our open source packages. The last step is to generate a client. As mentioned, if you're familiar with the OData client generation, you will find things that are very similar here. We improved some of the API in the CLI of the OpenAPI generator, and will also soon update, or soon is hard to say, but at some point also update the OData generator. But semantically, they're doing a very similar thing, namely take a specification for a service, generate a client out of it. And the mandatory parameters, I have listed them here, are the input. So you have to provide either a directory or a file that contains specifications. So you can do this for one specification or a directory with multiple specifications, and an output directory where the clients will be generated to. Once you have generated, so this is the steps that you need for generating your own client. Today, I will show you an example that is based on the SAP Cloud SDK, on the SAP Workflow API. And I will generate this, but normally this would not be the way how you would do that, because we, as Kavita mentioned, we already released a pre-generated client for this service. So to use that, you would rather install the library here, so the library directly, instead of generating it on your own. But I want to show you the benefits of the generator, and maybe you have a service for yourself that you need to generate, therefore this might be interesting. The name of the library here is, just please take note of that. This is an internal library, which is free, but it's not open source. And therefore the scope here is a bit different. And the Cloud SDK is part of the name of the library. Okay, then I would like to quickly show you what we're gonna do. So, and what the workflow service is and what we're gonna work with today. So let's take a look at my very simple workflow here. This is the Business Application Studio. And what I did here is I really, I introduced a workflow, which is really simple. It really contains just one task. And this task, it's just my user task, and it only contains this form, which basically says you can approve something. So the idea here is you have a workflow, and in order to complete the workflow, you complete a request by approving it. And once you completed this task, you complete the whole workflow. So yeah, just FYI, this is very simple, and I will not concentrate on the features of workflow today, but rather on how to use the APIs around it, and around other services as well. So my example will mostly contain different steps that might be interesting when you want to execute requests, different kinds of requests against a service. Okay, back to the slides quickly. So the use case that I will show you today contains 4 steps again. First of all, I will start an instance of the workflow. So we saw the workflow before, and I will start an instance of this. So what we saw was the definition, and I will start an instance. The second part will be, I will see what tasks this instance has. The third step will be to complete the task. And in the last step, I will show you how to get the execution logs. Just to complete the example here. If for some reason it is not clear what a workflow is and how it works and why now this completes a state or a step or something like this, don't worry. This is not what I'm trying to get across. So what I'm trying to get across is really what does the API look like, and yeah, what are the capabilities of the OpenAPI clients. Okay, and with that, I will stop the presentation here maybe. So that is a bit nicer, and go over to this one, to Visual Studio Code. So now what we see here is a short or a small, clear this, and also here. What I did here is I have a small app that does not really contain much in it here. So you can see that I have downloaded the specs. So this is my workflow service file. This is in YAML format. Our generator understands YAML and JSON as long as it's valid, OpenAPI, a valid OpenAPI specification. I have downloaded the generator already. So I installed the generator. I also installed the workflow service because I want to show that later on. But first of all, what is important, I installed the generator. So the first step that I showed you before. And now with this generator, I want to generate the OpenAPI service here. So we've seen that the command was called OpenAPI generator. Let's do this. It's a bit faster because I'm typing too slow. So the steps that you see here is I have the name of the OpenAPI generator. As I explained before, we have the input. I want to input this directory, so I'm passing specs, and I'm expecting to create an output directory that is called out. So that is it, and this is what is generated. Just a quick look at what we have here. There are two parts. So there's this schema, which contains the data or schemas basically that are defined in the OpenAPI specification. So if you're familiar with OpenAPI, the schema will probably, or definition in the old version of Swagger will tell you something. I would say that this is basically any data that you can, or the schema specification for any data that you contain or that you have in your API. And the rest are APIs. So before I go into details on how this is generated, let's first take a look at how this actually works. So now I have my test file here, and I now want to import these things from my API that I just generated. And those are APIs that I will use in my example in a few seconds. I will explain what those APIs are, but for now, I'm just importing them. My program actually, so my demo program here contains of those 4 steps that I showed before on the slide. So first of all, I will start a workflow instance, and I wrote a function for this. I will get the task instance that's, so there's only one task, so I will get this one task instance. I will complete the task and then get the execution logs and then show you all this. I would like to first of all live code the first one, and the rest I will just explain a bit and run over with debug mode so that you can see what is happening. But the code is very similar and quite simple, straightforward. So I assume that this will be fine. So in the first step to start a workflow instance, what I'm doing is first of all I'm passing a definition API, so an ID for the definition. So the workflow that I showed in the browser before, so this one is called my workflow. So I'm using this ID to start an instance for this definition. I also created a destination. If you are not familiar with the concept of destinations, I will not go into details on this, but you can easily read it up in our documentation. Just a short notice or a short explanation of what this is. You can imagine a destination, and if you would want to explain it in a very simple way, to be a URL, but usually destination contains a bit more authentication and other things that are defined on usually SAP Business Technology platform. So there you have the destination service, and the SDK supports you in defining a destination. So basically defining your system that you want to go against. So this request that I'm creating here will go against my destination, my service. and the workflow that I want to create will be an instance of the workflow definition that we saw before. Okay, let's go into the code here. What we see, or what I want to do to start a workflow is I want to execute a post request against this URL, and found this on the documentation of the API Hub, or in the documentation on API Hub on the SAP Workflow API, and now I will implement this using the SDK. So the API for this, and that is something that that I know already, is the Workflow API, Workflow Instance API. So Instances API. That is an API that you find here. So this was here generated as part of the client. And to start an instance, or before I start an instance, so those are the possibilities they have. I can get information on instances, I can query instances, update instances, and so on. But now, for now, first of all, I want to start an instance. To start an instance, here in the API docs, you can see that the starting requires a body. So the body has the type workflow instance start payload, and this is also something that you can then find in the schema. So in the start payload, you will find it here. In order to understand what this really is, I can just use auto-completion. I will see I can pass some properties, the context, attachments as optional, but here the definition ID is what is required. So I will pass the definition ID. And that is basically it to set up a request. So that would already be the request to, or basically set up or build the request. But there is more to it. I could, for example, add custom headers if I want to add some custom authorization, for example, or if I want to add custom request configuration, I can do that. I can also execute the request by not getting data. So what we do is a simple form of deserialization of the data with execute, and with execute raw, you get the whole response with status code and so on. So those are all possibilities, but we now want to concentrate on the execution. So we just execute, and to execute, we have to pass the before mentioned destination, which is going against my workflow API here. And that is now really the final or ready to use request. This is an asynchronous function, so this returns an instance or a workflow instance, which is a promise. So if I return that, this function will return a promise of workflow instance here. And now let's try this. I'd like to run this here in debug mode so that I can continue with the next steps after this. Okay. I use TS Node. What I forgot to mention before, this is now Typescript. I usually do my examples in Typescript, but the almost exact same code would also work for JavaScript. So you could just reuse this code basically and just leave out everything that's annotated with a type, and you would have JavaScript. So that's just on the side. TS Node, and the file is main. Okay, so this is the function that we just wrote. What I get here is my my workflow instance. Go to the debug console. So the workflow instance looks like this. There are some additional information on the instance. You can see that the definition ID that we passed before. So this is just information on the workflow itself. The idea of the workflow instance now, when it was started, the status, and so on. So yeah, that is what we did here. And the second step that I wanted to execute was to get the instance, the tasks of this, or the task of this workflow. No, that is not what I wanted. So for that, let's just create one here. Before this demo, today I had an issue here, but this now looks great. Okay, so what do we see here? We want to get the task instance, so I passed the ID of the workflow that we just created. So we saw the instance here, and the ID was the 89 something, and here I'm passing 89 something to this function, and again my destination. And now I'm using a different API. Here we use the user task instances API that is more concentrated. So the workflow API or workflow instances API was more concentrated on the workflow itself. The user task instances API is more concentrated on the user tasks, as the name implies. And now what I want to do is I want to get all instances or all tasks or task instances, this is important, that are related to my workflow instance that I just created. For this, I just execute the query instances function here, or the query instances API. There are other functions on this as well. So again, I could get some other data around specific instances around properties like attachments, attributes, and so on. But let's not go into this right now. The query instances here now actually, if you look at this, at this, you can see that it has one parameter. It's a bit difficult to read, but this is the query parameter that you can pass. And for query instances, you only have this optional parameter. So theoretically, you could just query instances and get all of them. But what we now want to do is we want to get a specific instance, and this is or a list for a specific workflow. And for this, we need to pass some additional filter information, basically. And this was the instance ID. So yeah, workflow instance ID, as we have seen before. Once that is done, so yeah, here again, we execute this against the destination, and you can see, so what I get back is a list for this, and I'm just looking at the first element in this list. So this here is a destructured instance, so I'm just getting a list with one element, and the one element here is, yeah, the user task. Let's take a look at what the data here is. So again, maybe jump over it because that is a bit nicer to read here. So if I jump over to here, we can see that this is the logged task instance. This was logged here, this line. And you can see that again, it was just created. It has a definition ID, its own definition ID again for the task. It has its own ID. So for the task, the ID of the task, and it also references the instance ID that we saw before, 89 something. Right. And what is maybe also interesting is the status here is now ready. So the next step that I wanted to execute is to complete the task. So I created a function here. Note that completing a task, this is a put request in the end. It does not return a response, so we don't have anything to return here, just task completed. And as this is an asynchronous action, we have to wait for it to be done before we can continue with the next step. Here again, I'm passing the instance ID, so the ID of the task instance, and again, the destination. So let's take a look at the task. So what do we have here? Again, we're using the task instances API because we're again concentrating on the task instance. So we now want to update something or update the task instance. For this, we have the update instance function. And I just want to quickly show you the options that you have in this. So here in the documentation, you can see you have two mandatory parameters. The first one is the ID of the task instance. So the task instance ID, and a body, which is the update task instance payload. The ID, first of all, is part of the URL. So here you can see, I said put before, but I meant patch. So I'm executing a patch request here that goes against this API, and it has a mandatory path parameter that is also mandatory from the API of the generated client here. In addition to this, you have to pass the body, the body basically here contains these additional properties. So you can pass whatever here, what is necessary. If I'm not mistaken, is just the status here, but that is of course different for different APIs. Now in this example, I'm just setting the context here. So maybe if you remember the form, but this is really not so important. I'm just setting this to true. So I want to approve the requests of my user task here. And the important part is that I now want to set the status of this task to completed. And once this is, and then I want to execute it. And once this is done, our task should be completed and also our workflow should be completed. So just to remember, if this task is completed, it immediately goes into the end. So the workflow should be completed here as well. So let's jump over this as well. Yeah, okay, so we now landed here in the task completed. There's not much to see. So to check whether this completion actually worked, I wanted to get the execution logs as well to kind of see the full picture here. So what are we doing in the execution logs? Again, we're looking at, so execution logs are basically the activities that happened around a specific workflow or workflow instance. And now here we have the workflow instance ID again that I'm passing. And let's take a look at what is happening here. So this is again another GET request, but here different to the first GET request that we made. I again have a path parameter that I need to pass. It's a mandatory path parameter. Again, you can see this here in the API. So here you can see that this is mandatory. It's not optional. Again, I executed, so there's not much new in here. But to confirm that the update actually worked, we can go over to this, and we should see the execution logs here. You should see the execution logs here in the logs. And you can see, let's not go into too much detail on what was happening here, but the 3 steps, because there's a lot of IDs and so on. But the 3 steps that we see here is, first of all, the workflow was started. Second, the user task was created, and which was together with the workflow. You can also see the time is very close. And the third thing that happened here that was written to the log is that the user task was completed. Okay. Yeah, that's actually it for the steps. So this is how you would use an OpenAPI client generated by the SDK, either generated on your own or pre-generated. So theoretically, you can also use the pre-generated library here, and you have the same API. So there you would see the same thing. What I now would like to show you in addition to this is, maybe you noticed that we have these multiple APIs here. I also showed that here on the side, you have multiple APIs. And now the question is, how do those APIs work, or how are they generated, and how can you customize that? Especially in the workflow case, actually, and that's also why I chose this example. You have, yeah, it's not huge, but a bigger API, and you can see that it contains multiple topics that it's concentrated around, and we call these things APIs. And in these APIs, you have many operations. So we saw that the workflow instances API, for example, has these functions, or provides these abilities here. And if you see that you have an instance, you get an instance, you want to start an instance, there might be something similar for tasks, because we're now talking about workflow instances, but for tasks, you might also have the task instance. And then again, you would have the same name. According to the OData standard, you are not allowed to provide multiple names that are duplicates. So in your OpenAPI document, you would not be able to specify the name start instance, for example, for multiple APIs. So multiple times throughout the document. Maybe I'll just show an example. So here you can see that the workflow instances, well, this is not so great. You could yeah, I had this not so well thought through here at this stage. What I wanted to say is usually you have a parameter that can be used for a generation, and I will show this in the slides in a second. In the workflow case, for example, and this can be useful in other cases as well, we allow to provide your own name by providing the SAP Cloud SDK operation name for names of an operation, and similar for the API name. Let's switch to the slides so that this becomes a bit clearer. I hope I'm not confusing you here. So to group APIs, as I mentioned just a second ago, we have multiple APIs within one client that is generated. The name of the APIs originates by default originates by the from the tag. So if you have a tag on your API or on a specific path, then this tag will be used as a name. So if in case of this, in this example, what you would get is the workflow API. There is a fallback if there is no tag. So in case you have no tags, we just call it default API for all APIs that have no tag. The next level basically of customization, so you can also customize this, is by providing the this vendor extension here, which is called SAP Cloud SDK API name. And based on this, we will generate your API name. And here you can see we'll take this over and usually also append API. Here it's not necessary. The same applies to operations. Or something very similar applies to operations. Usually you have this operation ID. That is what I meant before. And this can be only unique throughout the file. So if in the workflow case, for example, we would have to use get workflow instances instead of get instances as we saw in the example, or query instances. And therefore the name would be a bit duplicate, because then you would have the API workflow API dot get workflow instances. So use the keyword workflow twice, which might be a bit more complex than you would wish for. So that would be based on the operation ID. That is the default. As a fallback, again, if there is no operation ID, we use the path and the method name to get a name for the path. So here we would use get v1 workflow instances based on the path here that you see. And again, customizing is possible through the SAP Cloud SDK API name, and this here specifies the name that you can use. Okay, then I have a few tips and tricks as a last step. So if you want to generate an API, there are some things that might be interesting to make it a bit nicer and to tweak it so that it's usable if you're using it regularly. So maybe let's start from the top. First of all, when you're using the generator and you're using it multiple times, it makes sense to use the clear output directory flag here, because if you don't, what will happen is the following. Just generate again. You will get an error because the files already exist. So we didn't want to break anything if you're already using the directory for something. So what you can do is clear the output directory before generating anything. So once you do that, the directory will be deleted and then everything will be generated anew. There are also similar flags that you can use for slightly different cases, but I will not go into detail on this. If you're interested in that, just go to the documentation. I will just show the main parts that I think are interesting. The next thing that I think is interesting is maybe you saw the name of this directory here is a bit ugly. So we have out and then WFS API complete CF, which is not so nice to read, and you might want to change this. It's also possible that for some reason you cannot change the name of the file, so you can just simply change the name of the file for this. But if you have multiple services and maybe you got them from a different source centrally somehow, this might be a bit annoying. So for this, we have another parameter, which is called options per service. And you can either provide a directory or a file name or a file. And this file has to contain options for, options per service, basically. I added this white space here. As I'm now lazy, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna, I mistyped this. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna run this. And you can see that there's a new file created, which is called options per service. You can choose the name as you wish, but just to make it quick, what happens here is that it uses the file or the path to the specification, specifies a few things around it. So you have the package name. If you have an NPM package generated, which you can also do with some other options, which I will not show today, the name of the directory where this is generated, and the name of the service, which is the name as it is referred to with the service in the documentation. So I think here in the documentation, you will see this is the string that is currently used, and you can just customize that by overwriting it. I'll just quickly do this for the directory to do this quickly, and then maybe also this workflow API, and then save and run again. You can see that the directory name here changed, and if I go to this file, it references the workflow API service here, which is a bit nicer and might be helpful if you're generating multiple services and especially want to customize some of the names. And the last thing that I wanted to show. So I was talking about Typescript, and all this is written in Typescript, and what the generator generates is Typescript in the first place. But what you can also do in addition to generating Typescript is transpiling it to JavaScript directly. For this, we have the transpile option, and you can just add it to the end of this command. And what will happen then, you can see it here already, it will transpile the generated sources to JavaScript mappings, typing files, and typing mappings. And that is basically it. So if you want to use JavaScript, you can do this. You can also provide your own TS config for this and so on. So you can also customize that further. But just to show that this is possible, I wanted to show you that. Because this might be also useful if you want to share your service with somebody else who maybe does not want or cannot use TypeScript or uses a different version or something like this. Yeah, and that's it from my side. And I would hand back to Kavita to come to the conclusion.
Thanks, Marika. So let me quickly summarize what we learned today. We saw how we could easily generate a type-safe client for an OpenAPI spec. For the purpose of this demo, we used the specification of the SAP Workflow API service. We also saw how to use the generated client to create some workflow instances, basically the entire flow of creating the workflow instances, the task instances, and creating and starting the task. And we also saw some tips and tricks on how to customize the generated API. Marika, can you go to the next slide?
Sure.
Yeah, so all of this is documented in our documentation portal. Please do visit our documentation portal. Not only this, there are multiple well-documented usage scenarios of the SDK. You can always reach out to us with your issues via GitHub. And you can also follow the SAP Cloud SDK community tag for the recent updates on the calls that we are scheduling. Next slide, please, Marika. Also, we recently introduced a new feedback snippet in our documentation portal. If you are visiting our documentation portal, please do provide some feedback, as it would help us in further improving the quality of our portal. Well, that's it from our side. We hope today's presentation was useful and informative for you. With that, we open for the Q&A session. Any questions?
You can use the Q&A tab for posting questions. And I see there's a question in the chats.
Yeah, maybe I can read that out. Okay, so wasn't there from the beginning, so it might be that this was clarified here. The workflow API is just an example of what the OpenAPI generator can do. Yeah, that's right. I hope there
Yes.
is a pre-generated library for the workflow API. Yes, so there is a workflow, a pre-generated library available for the workflow API in both Java and JavaScript libraries.
Yeah. What I forgot a bit, I actually wanted to show that as well, but somehow I forgot that. So I installed it before, and you can just use it the same way. I just wanted to also show the features of the generator. And as you can see, there are no compilation errors, at least, so it does the same thing.
Okay, is it possible to generate OpenAPI specs from OData metadata somehow?
That is an interesting thought. I don't know of a way. We're not planning on anything like this. I know that many of the OData services actually also have OpenAPI specifications, but where they come from and how they're created, I don't know that. Yeah, so I mean, if it's of interest, I could try to find out that, but with our generators, at least I can safely say this is not possible in any direction. Yes, so there's another, so we have two generators basically for both Java and JavaScript, which each are available for OpenAPI. So if you want to create your service for, or your client for OpenAPI, that's what I showed today. But what we had for a longer time already is the generator for OData, and that you can also use, and it will create a very similar API, which is more evolving around the flow of OData, which is a bit different. But maybe that's even, I mean, OData is also special there, right? And what I mean by special is especially if you think of filtering capabilities and so on, I assume this would not be easy to express in OpenAPI. So I'm not sure how good the OpenAPI specs would reflect the OData specs, but I don't know that. So, and that is also a good question. In OData, we have, so I just read it out, how are dates handled in the generated OpenAPI clients. In the OData ones, one has to use Moment.js. So we don't do any, so this is not only related to dates, but also any other types. We don't do any serialization in that sense. So everything that is given to the OpenAPI clients is also retrieved that way. So if it's a string, it's a string. If it's something else, it's something else. But we don't use any additional libraries or date handling there. That might be a nice addition in the future.
Okay, there are no more questions. So I think we have come to the conclusion of this session. I pass it on over to you, Moshe.
Thank you very much. So thank you everyone for attending the call today. Going forward, we will move to an ad hoc way of conducting these community calls and no longer having this series in Zoom. So in case you want to be notified when the next session will take place, please go and follow the SAP Cloud SDK tag in the SAP community. So thank you everyone for joining, and I'll stop the recording now.